The memory that returns to me first is not the day they shut the plant down. It's the moment just before it when the overhead lights flickered once hard enough to cast long, trembling shadows across the concrete, then settled into the dull glow of a place taking its last breath. I remember the metallic echo of empty carts rolling down the hallway, the smell of coolant drying on machines that would never run again. The steady rhythm of boots moving past me without a word. Men don't stare at a sinking ship, they just walk off it. I can still see the glass office door closing behind me, muting the voice of a manager half my age reading from a script someone else wrote. Outside, the wind scraped along the siding and carried the cold under my collar. The sky had that washed-out color the Rust Belt wears when winter is near, when even the clouds seem tired. But the real moment, the one that stayed, came later alone in the garage. A single bulb buzzed above me, throwing a pale ring of light over my father's tools, their edges catching like they were waiting for my hands again. The blueprint he left behind lay across my knees. The pencil lines still sure, still honest. That was when it hit me, not loud, not sudden, just a steady truth rising through the quiet. They hadn't taken everything, some things they never touched. And that meant the story wasn't ending. It was only circling back to where it should begin. The memory that returns to me first is not the day they shut the plant down. It is the hallway lined with boxes. I still see them stacked against gray walls back in 2008. Cardboard sagging papers slipping out like the bones of a machine taken apart and forgotten. Men walked past with that quick glance people give things that once mattered but no longer fit the future. I remember thinking the worst part was watching forklifts haul away machines I had run for 20 years. I did not understand then that a man can disappear from paper long before he disappears from the payroll. The years that followed blurred together. New owners arrived with bright logos and slogans about progress. I stayed in the same town because roots sunk deep in Rust Belt soil are not easily pulled. I showed up early, stayed late, kept my head down while managers half my age talked about efficiency and culture. They used words that had never fixed a jammed spindle or saved a delayed shipment. I did the work. They handed out index cards about teamwork. I kept my distance and let them run their course. The morning they called it restructuring the sky was the same washed-out gray I had seen 1,000 times. They put me in a glass office with a man whose shirt looked pressed by a machine. He read from a printed statement. He talked about transitions and future priorities. My name did not appear once. On the desk between us lay a brochure so glossy it almost shined. It showed a drill shank under a modern brand label, sleek and cold. Beneath it was a line crediting Bradley Kincaid as designer. I stared at the picture more than I listened. That piece of steel had been my life's work. I knew each curve because I had shaped them with my father long before Bradley ever touched a wrench. Seeing another man's name under it felt like someone reaching into my chest and taking out the one part still beating steady. They gave me a cardboard box when it was done. My mug, my tape measure, a faded photo of Jacob at 10. A security guard half my age walked me out. He tried to make small talk, then gave up. The air outside was cold enough to sting. I sat in my truck with the engine off, watching my breath fade on the windshield. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a man without weight, like I could be lifted by the wind and not leave a shadow behind. Home did not feel any warmer that night. The heater rattled in the vents. The house felt hollow in the quiet way places do when bad news lingers in the corners. Out in the garage, the concrete held the chill of winter. I clicked on the bulb hanging from the rafters. Yellow light spilled onto the workbench and tools that had shaped most of my life. My father always said you can read a man's history on the back wall of his garage. Looking at mine, I was not sure anymore what story it told. While searching for a wrench, I opened a metal cabinet and found a thick envelope wedged behind an old box of welding rods. My father's handwriting covered the front. Only my name. Nothing more. The paper was soft at the edges as if it had been waiting for my hands. I sat on the workbench and opened it carefully. Inside was the first version of the drill shank, a hand-drawn blueprint from 1998 on graph paper, pencil lines straight and certain, dimensions written in that firm block script my father taught me when I was a boy learning how steel carries load. It was unmistakably the same design now printed in that brochure under Bradley's name, the same geometry, the same careful transitions to keep torque from tearing the metal apart. On the back of the final page, my father had written a single sentence. Never let them take the soul out of the steel, no explanation, no softness, just a line meant for a future he knew he would not see. I sat there for a long time with the papers on my knees. The bulb hummed above me. Outside, the wind dragged branches across the siding. Inside, all I heard was my own breath rising and falling, a small sound in a large room. Morning found me at the diner where the old shop hands used to meet before first shift. The place smelled of bacon and burnt coffee. Booth seats cracked at the corners. The kind of diner that outlives every recession because people need somewhere to sit when life gets heavy. I chose a booth by the window and kept my eyes on my cup. An older machinist spotted me and walked over. He slid into the seat without asking, looked at me for a moment, then spoke in a quiet way that carried truth. You were the gold standard around here. Rust Belt shops used to measure their work against yours. He did not say it with pity. He said it like a fact carved in steel when he left the words stayed on the table long after the plate was cleared. Back home, Jacob moved around the kitchen with the careful steps of someone avoiding broken glass. Foreclosure letters lay unopened on the counter. He picked one up, stared at it, then set it down again. He finally asked if I was doing all right. He said it with his back half turned like he already knew the answer. I told him I was fine. Men like me use that word the way welders use clamps, to hold things together long enough to get through the day. After he left for work, I returned to the garage with my laptop. Years ago, during the bankruptcy, someone had sent me a link to a digital archive of contracts. I had looked at it once, then moved on. Now I opened the folder again. The scan of the intellectual property transfer agreement loaded slowly, streaked with marks from an old copier. My name appeared in the early sections, tied to legal phrases that never felt like they belonged to the world I understood. Page by page, I searched for the moment where I had signed away my design. The scan jumped near the end. My signature was visible. But where Bradley's confirmation should have been, the image cut off. No ink, no initials, only a faint shadow where a signature might have been if the page had ever been present. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred. I tried enhancing the brightness. I scrolled back and forth. Nothing changed. The original contracts were long gone. The only surviving record was this imperfect scan. If that final page had never been signed, then the rights may never have shifted at all. Everything the company claimed afterward might rest on a missing sheet of paper. I set the laptop aside and spread the blueprint across my knees. The pencil lines caught the light. Outside, the wind eased. Inside, something steadier took its place. Not anger, not pride. Something older. The quiet knowledge a man feels when he recognizes unfinished work calling him back. I turned off the light and let the darkness settle. Slowly, the shapes of my father's tools emerged on the wall. Wrenches, calipers, hammers, outlines I could recognize by touch in total darkness. That was when the thought came to me without force, maybe they were wrong. The company, the town, maybe even Jacob. Maybe I was not finished. I stood there in the cold sense of the garage blueprint in my hand. Contract scans still glowing faintly on the table, and felt something inside me shift. Not fast, not loud, just steady. Like a machine waking after too many years without power. The faint morning light in the garage had barely settled before I felt the weight of the night still pressing at my ribs. Something inside me had shifted steady and firm. But it needed somewhere to go. I moved through the day without speaking much. I sorted tools I did not need to sort, cleaned a workbench that did not need cleaning. Tried to keep my hands busy while my mind stayed fixed on the missing signature and the blueprint folded in my coat pocket. By late afternoon, I knew I could not stay in the garage any longer. The walls had begun to feel too close. The Chamber of Commerce dinner was the kind of event men attended out of habit rather than hope. The parking lot was crowded when I pulled in. Inside, warm lights bounced off the rented tablecloths, and the same faces floated from group to group with practiced smiles. The air smelled of overcooked chicken and perfume that did not belong in a room full of welders, accountants, and small business owners. I stood near the back wall again, a place where the noise softened enough to think. Bradley stepped onto the small stage in a fitted suit that caught the LED spotlights and made him look manufactured. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed luck had chosen him personally. He raised his hands, spoke about innovation growth and the bright future of American manufacturing. When his slide deck shifted to a picture of the drill shank, the applause came quick. He let it linger. Somewhere near the front, he made a remark about old habits slowing new progress. The room reacted with polite laughter, the kind that stings more than open mockery. No one said my name, but I felt the ripple pass through the crowd anyway. I left before the speeches ended. The night air outside was sharp. Frost clung to windshields and the streetlights overhead buzzed like tired insects. I walked toward my truck with my hands deep in my coat. Footsteps echoed behind me. When I turned, Ronnie Mathers stood a few feet away. Shoulders hunched, breath unsteady. He looked smaller than I remembered, like life had been sanding him down, grain by grain. He stepped closer, eyes darting across the lot as if checking for witnesses. His hand came out of his coat pocket, trembling as it pressed a USB drive into my palm. He held my hand there for a second, squeezing harder than a man should when giving someone a piece of plastic. I cannot carry this anymore. His voice barely rose above the wind. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but he was already turning away. He walked fast, never looking back, disappearing between two parked cars like a shadow slipping under a door. I stood there alone, my hands still closed around the USB, the cold settling deeper into my coat. The garage lights flickered on when I stepped inside. I placed the laptop on the bench, sat down slowly and connected the drive. A folder opened with a stutter, then filled with files. Email threads, attachments, internal memos. I clicked one, then another, and another. Every line felt like a slow punch to the ribs. My name deleted from engineering notes. Comments mocking my pace, plans laid out in clean language as if removing a man was simply another operational adjustment. One message showed Bradley bragging about updating the Shanks story to make it his own. Another pushed for phasing me out quietly so no one would question the shift in credit. I kept scrolling. A thread titled Meeting Prep caught my eye. I opened it. The words pulled me forward. They described an investor I had never met but had once admired from afar. Franklin Boyd, someone with enough influence to change a man's career if he believed in the work. Bradley had blocked the meeting before it could happen. He had written that I would not impress anyone in the new decade, that the company needed a younger face to pitch innovation. I read that line twice, not because I questioned its meaning. I read it because something old and heavy tightened inside me. The kind of tightness a man feels when he realizes the floor he fell through was built intentionally. A faint creak came from the doorway. I lifted my head. Jacob stood there, one hand braced on the frame, his eyes moving between me and the glowing screen. His voice came slow, careful, as if he feared breaking whatever I was holding together. "Dad, what are you going to do?" I let the question hang for a moment. The garage was quiet enough to hear the soft hum of the laptop fan. I looked at my son, at the worry tucked behind his eyes, at the exhaustion of someone who has watched too much crumble in too little time. "Take back what is ours." My voice came out low, not angry, not sharp, just steady. His jaw tightened in a small nod, the kind a man gives when he understands something without needing to speak it. He stepped back into the hallway and disappeared, leaving the faint scent of cold air behind him. I turned back to the screen. More emails, more quiet betrayals shaped into sentences. They painted a clear picture, one too sharp to ignore. A room full of men had built their futures on the pieces of mine. The truth was there in front of me, line after line, and I kept reading even when my eyes burned. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches and brushed softly against the siding. The sound mixed with the quiet click of the mouse under my hand. The night stretched thin. Hours passed. At some point, the first thin line of dawn crept under the garage door, touching the concrete in a pale streak that grew inch by inch. I closed the laptop and let the silence settle again. The USB lay beside the blueprint on the bench. One born of betrayal, one born of a man's craft. The light from the rising sun caught the edges of both, turning them the same muted shade of silver. The air felt different, still cold, still heavy, but no longer empty. I stood there in the quiet, breathing slowly, letting the truth work its way through me. Not to harden me, but to steady me. The sun kept rising, inching across the floor until it brushed the toe of my boot. I did not move until it reached my hand. Then I lifted the blueprint, folded it once, and slipped it into my coat pocket. The garage remained silent. The day waited outside. I stepped toward the light, letting it guide my next breath. The light on the driveway was thin and cold when I stepped out of the garage. It slid across the hood of the truck and caught on the salt stains left from old storms. The air bit at my face, but my mind felt clearer than it had in months. I stood there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the highway, then went back inside for the one thing I had not finished with. The USB was still on the workbench when I returned to the garage. It lay next to the folded blueprint, like a reminder that the past and the present were sharing space on the same piece of wood. I sat down, opened the laptop, and connected the drive again. The screen washed the room in its tired blue glow. My reflection floated faintly in it. A man I half recognized. I had already seen the emails about my name being erased in the meeting that never happened. This time I opened a different folder. Drawings, revisions, files with dates from the last few years and small notes in the subject lines. I clicked on one and watched a digital version of the shank appear, rendered in clean lines and numbers. It looked familiar until it did not. I zoomed in on the specifications. Somewhere in that sea of figures, a choice had been made. The steel listed was not the one my father had trusted, not the certified alloy we had used for decades because we knew how it behaved under stress. Bradley had swapped it for a cheaper grade, the kind you used when you wanted to save money and hoped no one ever pushed the part to its limits. I leaned back for a moment, staring at the laptop, listening to the faint buzz of the bulb overhead. Then I pulled a pad of paper toward me, found a pen that still worked, and began writing the numbers out by hand. Old habits surfaced, stress, load, safety margins that were not really margins when men were standing on platforms miles from help. My hand moved slower than it used to, but the muscle memory was still there. I ran the same calculations I had run in my 20s, the ones I used to scribble on the backs of order sheets because the plant's computers were too slow. I compared them in my mind with the failures I had seen over the years. Bent shafts, hairline cracks, metal that whispered before it screamed. When I reached the answer, I set the pen down and stared at the paper. The part would not hold the way it was being sold. Under real load with real men depending on it, the steel would give up too soon. It would not show up under showroom lighting or in slide decks. It would show up on a rig in the middle of a winter night far from anyone who knew why it broke. I went back to the emails searching for anything that might confirm what the numbers had already told me. There it was. Reports from the field, 2 incidents. One in North Dakota, one in Texas. Near misses, they called them. That was the phrase they used when no one died but could have. One report described the shank twisting off under load and whipping through the air before lodging in a guardrail instead of a man's chest. The pictures were attached, blurred, grainy. Enough. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. This was not just about my name on a design anymore. This was about what that design had become in other hands. Corners had been cut, men had been put in harm's way, and it was my work twisted into something I had never signed off on, carrying the risk. I printed what mattered. The machine coughed itself awake and pulled page after page into its throat. The sound of paper feeding through the rollers filled the garage with a mechanical rhythm I knew well. Each sheet slid out warm, carrying proof of a story someone thought they had buried in digital folders in corporate language. I stacked the prints carefully. The original blueprint went on top, the contract scan, the key emails, the comparison between what was promised and what was actually made. I found an old folder in the cabinet and slid the stack inside. It had once held safety protocols. Now it held something that felt heavier. I closed it and ran my hand along the worn edge. My father's handwriting flashed in my mind, the line about the soul in the steel. I did not need to say it out loud. It was already in the room. By the time I checked the clock, the morning had turned into late afternoon. The light outside had shifted to that muted color that comes before evening settles in for good. I walked into the kitchen and opened the drawer where we kept chargers and stray batteries. There was an old phone number on a folded paper, a remnant from a time I thought I might call an investor, and never did. I went back to the laptop and searched for Franklin Boyd. The company name was different now, smaller, quieter. But the address was still in Pennsylvania, not that far from where I stood. I dialed the number, listening to the ring as if it were echoing from another life. A woman answered, her voice steady and professional. I told her my name. There was a pause on the line, sharper than I expected. Her tone changed when she spoke again. "You are the engineer from the old plant, the one with the drilling system." She did not say it like a question. She asked how soon I could come by. I told her I could be there the next day. She said she would check his schedule. I heard muffled sounds, a door closing somewhere on her end. When she came back, she gave me a time. I wrote it down on the edge of yesterday's mail. After dinner, I took the folder back to the garage and laid it open on the bench. I added a notepad, a pen that would not fail me, and a copied page with the field reports of the near misses. I placed everything in an old leather briefcase that had not seen daylight in years. The hinges creaked when I closed it. The sound made me think of doors that had been shut too long. Jacob arrived home later than usual, work boots dusty, shoulders bowed from lifting more than he should have in a day. He saw the briefcase on the bench and the truck keys beside it. His eyes moved to my face, then back to the folder, taking in more than I said. "You going somewhere?" His voice was quiet, careful, not wanting to push if I was not ready to share. I tightened the strap on the briefcase and set it upright. The weight felt right in my hand. Got a drive in the morning. That was all I said. It was all that needed saying. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment, studying me the way a man studies a blueprint before deciding whether to trust it. There was something different in his eyes. Less fear, more recognition. He watched as I checked the documents one last time, the way I used to check tools before leaving for a big job years ago. Everything in its place, nothing left to chance. You need anything. He asked it without urgency, more like an offer to stand behind me if the ground shifted. I shook my head. Then I paused. Keep an eye on the house. He nodded. Simple, solid. He stepped aside to let me pass, then turned back and looked once more at the briefcase on the bench at the blueprint edge, peeking out. I could see the understanding settle over his features. It was not about revenge in his mind. It was about seeing his father decide he was not going to stay on the floor. I turned off the garage light. The briefcase waited by the door, ready for the morning. The house grew quiet around us. Somewhere outside, a truck rolled past on the road, its engine fading into the distance. I stood in the dark for a long breath, feeling the weight of paper and steel and years of silence gathered in one small bag, and listened to the soft sounds of the house as it settled into night. The morning air in that Pennsylvania town carried the kind of quiet that settles on places time has stopped trying to hurry. Frost clung to the grass outside the small brick office where Franklin Boyd still ran what was left of his investment firm. When I stepped inside, the warmth felt almost unfamiliar after the long drive. His assistant looked up, and I saw the moment she recognized my name. She asked me to wait, her voice soft but certain, and disappeared behind a heavy wooden door. A few minutes later, she returned and led me down a short hallway. Franklin's office sat at the end, lit by a single window that let in the pale winter sun. He stood when I entered, older than I remembered from the industry magazines, but with eyes that were sharp enough to cut steel. He gestured for me to sit, and I placed the folder on the table between us. He opened it without a word. He spent a long time studying the original blueprint. His fingers traced the pencil lines the way a man reads an old map of a place he once knew well. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something steady. "They can copy the lines," he said quietly, "but they cannot copy the hands that made them." The words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The steam rising from his untouched coffee curled in the light. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, something older. We sat with 2 cups of black coffee between us, letting the silence carry its own weight. He asked about the old plant, about the men who had worked there, about the years when craftsmanship still meant something in our corner of the Rust Belt. I could see the disappointment settle over him as he realized how much had been lost in the rush for speed and scale. He leaned back and rubbed his forehead, the gesture of a man who had seen too many pitches and trusted the wrong one. "I put $2.8 million into Bradley's vision," he said. He looked down, almost to himself. "Worst call I made in 20 years. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But the truth was sitting right there on the table, the lines of the drawing, older than the company that had tried to bury them. Franklin slid one of the printed emails toward me, the one showing how Bradley kept him from ever seeing my version. "If I had seen this," he said, "I would have backed the right man." No praise in his voice, only regret. Regret carries its own gravity. On the drive back home, the sky had turned the color of cold metal. The road unwound in front of me, and my thoughts moved with it. Somewhere between the miles of empty fields and the small towns holding on to what they could, I realized I no longer felt the same weight in my chest. Something steadier had taken its place. When I walked through the door, Jacob was already home. His jacket hung crooked on a chair, and his lunchbox sat half open on the counter. He told me the warehouse where he worked had received a shipment from Bradley's company earlier that week. Several shanks had snapped during routine tests. Supervisors were trying to keep it quiet while they figured out what to do next. The panic beneath his words was obvious, even if he tried to hide it. I asked him to bring me one if he ever had the chance. He nodded, the lines around his eyes tightening as he guessed why. After dinner, I went back to the garage. The space felt familiar again, the way it used to when work was still honest. My torch waited on the bench. I lit it and watched the flame sharpen into a clean blue edge. The sound filled the room, a steady hum that drowned out everything else. I pulled out the old steel stock I had kept for years, the good kind, the kind my father trusted. I measured, cut, and shaped it the way I had done hundreds of times before, letting my hands remember what my head thought it had forgotten. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The scent of heated metal and cutting oil wrapped around me like an old friend. When the final pass was done, I shut off the machine and let the room fall silent. The prototype lay in my hands, warm from the work, solid in a way Bradley's version never could be. The weight was right, the lines were right, the integrity was right. For the first time in months, I felt something align inside me. I set the piece on the table next to the stack of papers. The difference between them and what Bradley had said was more than a choice of metal. It was a choice of character. Anyone who knew the craft would see it instantly. Anyone who cared about safety would understand the risk he had created. The evidence was no longer scattered. It had shape now. It had form. It had teeth. I stood there with the torch cooling beside me and the finished part resting on the bench. The garage was quiet, but I felt the weight of a truth that had taken its time finding me. This was no longer about being replaced or forgotten. It was not about proving someone wrong. It was about the line between care and negligence, between shortcuts and responsibility. And now I had something that could expose the difference in a way no argument ever could. For the first time, I could see a path forming. Not the kind that led back to what I had lost, but the kind that pointed towards something steadier, something cleaner. Justice did not need to announce itself. It only needed a place to stand. The torch flickered subtly as it cooled. Dust settled in the beam of the overhead light. Outside, the night stretched quiet and long. I stayed there for a moment, resting a hand on the cooled steel, feeling the simplicity of its truth. Then I turned off the lights and let the darkness take the room. Morning found its way into the garage through the narrow window above the workbench, a pale strip of light cutting across the concrete. Dust hung in the beam, turning slowly in the cold air. I stood in the doorway with the briefcase in one hand and the finished shank in the other, listening to the quiet hum the house makes before anyone speaks. Somewhere down the hallway, Jacob was still asleep. The world outside did not know anything had changed. In here, everything had. Most men my age think twice before touching what little savings they have left. I did not think twice. I opened the desk drawer in the kitchen, pulled out the envelopes I had been ignoring, and set them aside. What I needed was deeper in the stack. Account statements, balances that were not impressive to anyone but me, numbers I had put away for later. Later had arrived. By midday, I was at the bank signing forms with a steady hand. The teller looked at me with the polite concern people reserve for older men drawing down their safety nets. I nodded at her, thanked her, and walked out with less money on paper and more resolve in my spine. The cold wind met me halfway across the parking lot. It felt almost welcome. Back in the garage, I cleared the clutter from the center of the floor. Old boxes went to the side. A broken lawn chair finally made it to the curb. I swept until the concrete began to look like a workspace again instead of a storage unit. The Bridgeport mill that had sat quiet in the corner for too long got my attention next. I checked the oil, tightened a few bolts, and let my hand rest on the metal. The machine felt like an old dog that had been waiting by the door, patient and ready. I printed a simple sign on the computer, nothing fancy, just a name that still meant something to me. Granger Tool Works. I taped it inside the small garage window that faced the street. No spotlight, no announcement, just letters and a promise I meant to keep. The first morning I opened early. The air bit at my breath while the mill warmed up, its low rumble filling the space steady and familiar. I worked the way my father had taught me. Slow when it needed to be slow. Precise when it mattered most. I did not cut corners. I did not rush. Each part moved through my hands, from raw steel to something that could be trusted miles away from any help. There was no website, no social media, no glossy brochure, just the sound of metal meeting metal and the kind of work that speaks for itself. A neighbor from down the street stopped by, first asking if I was really open, if I still did custom work. Word traveled the way it always travels in towns like ours. Through lunch pails and coffee breaks and tired conversations at the end of long shifts. Rig workers started showing up with quiet questions. Machinists from smaller shops brought parts that had failed when they should not have. I listened more than I spoke. Granger's stuff does not break. I heard that line secondhand one afternoon when a foreman from a drilling outfit came by. He said his crew had told him that in North Dakota and Texas, on jobs where the margin for error was thin as wire. He tested a piece in his hand, turned it over, nodded once, and asked how soon I could have 10 more ready. Jacob began stopping by the garage after his shifts at the warehouse. At first, he stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. The mill noise filled the gaps between us. I showed him how to read the faint marks on a worn tape, how to feel for vibration through the handle, how to tell by sound when a cut was right. He did not say much. Neither did I. Men in my family have never been good with speeches. We do better with passing down a way of doing things, one small adjustment at a time. One evening, he handed me a piece from Bradley S.'s latest batch. The fracture down the side told its own story. He did not need to explain where it came from. I set it beside mine on the bench. 2 answers to the same question. One built to last, one built to pass inspection long enough to be someone else's problem. Weeks later, the chamber sent out their invitations. Same hall, same stiff chairs, same cheap chicken. I went anyway, not to hear about their progress, but to look a man in the eye. The room buzzed with low conversation when I walked in. A few faces turned toward me and then away, the way people do when they are not sure which side of a story they believe yet. Bradley was near the front, talking to a cluster of business owners, smiling that polished smile that had impressed so many before. He saw me and his eyes narrowed just a touch before he smoothed it over. I stayed near the edge of the room until the formalities were over and the small talk began to scatter into corners. When the moment felt right, I walked toward him. The crowd around him thinned as people drifted toward the bar. He looked at me with a kind of friendly surprise that did not reach his eyes. "Tom," he said, like we were old friends crossing paths at a high school reunion. I let his greeting fall away. My voice stayed quiet. "Brad," I said, "ever find that missing signature page from 2008? The space between us tightened. The words were simple. The weight was not. For a second, the noise in the room dimmed. A few chamber members nearby stopped talking, their attention drawn the way people look at a tool they know might fail under load. Bradley's jaw flexed. His eyes flicked sideways, checking who was listening, who might understand what a missing page meant in our world. He forced a half smile that looked more like strain. "Paperwork from those days is a mess," he said, waving a hand, as if he could push the subject aside. "Old news." No one laughed. A man from a local fabrication shop I had worked with years back shifted his stance, watching Bradley now instead of me. Another owner, the type who has spent too many hours dealing with auditors, looked down at his drink and then back up with a tight frown. I did not press. I did not raise my voice. I let the question sit there between us like a crack visible on the surface of a part waiting for someone to deem how much it mattered. Then I stepped back, nodded politely, and left him standing there under the fluorescent lights. That night, the house felt different when I came home. Not bigger, not richer, just steadier. Jacob was at the kitchen table sorting through a pile of bills, a pen in his hand. When he saw me, he set the pen down and studied my face the way a man checks a level, making sure what he is looking at has finally come back true. "How did it go?" he asked. I hung my jacket on the chair, took a breath, and let it out slowly. "He heard me," I said. "That is enough for now." Jacob nodded. There was no fear in his eyes, no question about whether we would lose the house. No quiet panic about jobs or bank notices. What I saw instead was something I had not seen since he was a boy, watching me leave for the plant in the dark before dawn. It was pride, plain and solid. Later, when the house had gone quiet, I went back to the garage. The mill waited still and patient. I turned on the light, then the switch. The motor started with a low growl that settled into a smooth hum. Steel lay on the bench, ready for another day to be turned into something worth trusting. I set my hands on the machine, feeling the vibration work up through my arms, and let the sound fill the walls. No celebration, no announcement, just work. The kind of work that does not argue. The kind that will still be speaking long after everyone else in that chamber hall has gone home. Outside, the town settled into its own sleep. In the garage, under the steady light, the quiet rhythm of the mill carried on, marking the distance between the man I had been told I was and the man I had decided to be again. The morning after the chamber meeting carried a different kind of stillness. Not the quiet of defeat I had lived with for months, but the quiet that comes before a shift in weather. I opened the garage and let the cold air spill through the doorway. The mill came alive under my hand, humming low, steady as a heartbeat. Steel waited on the bench. The day felt like it knew something I didn't yet. By noon, Jacob pulled into the driveway, his truck tires crunching over patches of old gravel. He walked into the shop holding his phone, his face tight in a way that told me he had news he didn't want to deliver all at once. He kept his voice level, but the weight in it was clear. A drilling contractor in Texas had filed a lawsuit. One of Bradley's shanks had failed mid-operation and nearly taken a man's arm off. OSHA was already involved, the Department of Labor too. Words like investigation and liability were moving faster than the men who used the tools. I leaned against the workbench, letting the information settle. It didn't surprise me, not after what I had seen in those KD files. Gravity always finds the weak points. Steel tells the truth sooner or later. Jacob watched my expression, waiting for anger, maybe satisfaction. Neither came. I only nodded and told him to keep going with his day. Within a week, the whispers turned into statements. Warehouse inventory from Bradley's company had been sealed by federal inspectors. Pallets tagged, forklifts idle. No movement allowed until the reports were finished. Every shop foreman within driving distance seemed to understand what that meant. Supplies would stall, orders would shift. And in an industry where work lives or dies by reliability, no one wants to be standing next to a liability. The first call came from a small machine shop west of town. They needed parts fast, the right kind, not the ones that had put them on edge. The next call came from a drilling outfit in Ohio, then another from a contractor I had worked with 15 years earlier. They had heard I was machining again and that the parts were clean, correct, honest. I worked through each request with the same pace my father taught me. Slow where it should be slow. Never rushed. Let the steel take its time. Let the truth take its place. One cold afternoon, I heard a car door shut outside. When I stepped out of the garage, I saw Franklin walking toward me. Collar turned up against the wind, hands tucked into his coat. He looked older than he had during our meeting, but steadier too. Like he had already made the decision that brought him here. I opened the door wider and he stepped inside, taking in the noise of the mill, the smell of oil, the faint heat rising from the torch. He asked to see the prototype again. I handed it to him and watched him study it the way only a man who has paid dearly for trusting the wrong people can. He turned it in his hands, checked the grain of the steel, the edges, the weight. Then he walked the length of the garage in silence, nodding at the tools touching the bench. Looking at the older machines that had been with me longer than most friendships. 20 minutes passed like that, no pitch, no presentation, just two men standing in a room that only made sense to people who understood what precision costs. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Let's build this the right way. I felt something shift in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, something steadier. I wiped my hands on a rag and nodded once. That was enough for both of us. He left without shaking hands the way men do when they know a deal already exists in the space between them. The sun was setting by the time I closed up the shop. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and let the day settle into the quiet. Jacob was inside finishing dinner when the phone rang. The sound cut through the house, sharp and insistent. I answered and heard only breath, at first tight and uneven, then the voice I knew too well. Tom, I need you. Help me. We can fix this together. Everything in the background of his call sounded frantic. Papers rustling, doors opening, voices muffled with urgency. I stood in the hallway staring at the dark window. His fear traveled through the line like static. I let him finish speaking. Then I waited. The silence on my end stretched long enough for him to feel it. Brad, I said, you still don't have my signature. I lowered the phone and ended the call. The house settled back into quiet. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space between breaths. Jacob looked over from the kitchen doorway, reading something in my face he had not seen before. Not revenge, not bitterness. Something calmer, something decided. I set the phone on the counter and stepped into the living room, letting the suns take its place. Outside, the last light of the day faded behind the trees. The night moved in gently without hurry, as if it knew gravity was handling the rest. The phone was still on the counter the next morning when I stepped into the kitchen. The screen was dark, but the memory of that trembling voice from the night before clung to the quiet like a smell that refused to leave. I poured a small cup of coffee and let the heat settle into my hands. Outside, the sky was pale and heavy, the kind of morning that seems to hold its breath before something shifts. A soft crunch of gravel reached the window, a car door shut, slow, uncertain. I set the cup down and walked toward the garage. The cold air rushed in as I opened the side door, and there he was. Bradley. He looked smaller than I remembered. His coat hung off his shoulders, the collar bent out of shape, and the folder in his hand opened at one corner as if he had been clutching it through the night. His eyes were rimmed red, the exhaustion visible even before he spoke. Tom, he said barely above a whisper. We need to talk. I stepped aside. He walked into the garage like a man entering a room he was not sure he had the right to stand in anymore. His gaze moved over the mill, the organized bench, the tools aligned with the care of someone who understood what order means in a life that has seen too much chaos. He paused near the prototype, staring at it as if it were something he recognized too late. He laid the folder on the bench. His hands trembled when he opened it. A contract. Too polished. Too immediate. He tried to explain it, his voice cracking on certain words. A partnership, a way to stabilize operations, a shared brand. He said we could repair the damage if we acted quickly. Then he spoke of revenue projections and merged assets. But beneath all of that, I heard the truth in the thin strain of his voice. He needed someone to absorb the fall for him. He needed me to carry the weight he had created. I picked up the first pages. The legal phrasing was dense enough to fool a tired man, but not me. Liability shifted in tidy lines. Responsibility transferred in quiet paragraphs. Every failure his company faced would be traced back to my signature if I gave him one. It was not a deal, it was surrender, the last kind he could ask for. I set the papers back down. The garage went still. Even the mill seemed to hold its breath. "Brad," I said, my voice steady as the steel on the bench. "I am not here to clean up the mess you made." He flinched, not from volume, not from anger, from the truth. He tried to speak, but no words arrived. His eyes drifted toward the door as if he could find another version of this moment out there. One where he still held control, but gravity had taken over and he felt it. The kind of pull that brings a man face to face with everything he tried to outrun. He gathered the folder with slow, stiff fingers. No attempt to persuade me again. No bargaining. No false hope. He held the papers against his chest like a man shielding himself from a cold he could no longer escape. When he turned away, he did not look back. His steps were uneven, his breath loud in the quiet of the garage, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that felt more final than any words he could have spoken. I stood there for a long moment. The air felt different once he was gone, like a storm had passed without thunder. I let the silence settle, then walked deeper into the garage. The mill roared to life the moment I hit the switch. Jacob stood at the controls, sleeves rolled up, eyes narrowed with concentration. The cutter met the steel in a clean line, sending a curl of shavings across the floor. He did not notice me at first. His hands adjusted the feed with the kind of patience only men who love precision can manage. When he finally glanced my way, something in his expression changed. Not surprise, not awkwardness, something quieter, deeper. He studied my face as if searching for the man he had grown up with. And for the first time in a long stretch of years, I saw no hint of worry in his eyes, only steadiness, and a slight nod that said more than words could. I leaned against the workbench watching him work. The sound of the mill filled the space between us, a rhythm older than both of us combined. His movements had the beginnings of confidence, a feel for the craft, a respect for the steel. I recognized the same instincts my father taught me in a shop not so different from this one. I had spent years believing that legacy was lost. Yet here it was unfolding, one quiet cut at a time. Night eased its way over the house later, so unhurried. I sat at the kitchen table after dinner, sipping what was left of a cup that had long gone cold. When the laptop chimed, I opened it without thinking. The quarterly report stared back at me in neat lines. 1.4 million in revenue. I stared at the number, waiting for the weight of it to land. It did not. Money had once been the measure of everything I thought I wanted. Not anymore, dude. I closed the laptop gently and let the darkness return to the room. Something inside me loosened. Not pride, not relief, something simpler. A truth settling into the open space where fear had lived too long. I walked down the hall and turned off the last light. The bed felt warmer than I expected when I lay down. My breath settled steady and even, following the faint vibration of the mill still echoing in my memory. Sleep came quickly. It came easily. And for the first time in years, I did not fight it. The morning drifted in with a soft light that felt steadier than anything I had woken to in years. It filled the kitchen slowly at first. Then with a gentle insistence, as if the day already knew the weight it was meant to carry. I sat there for a while, letting the quiet settle before I opened the envelope on the table. The handwriting on the front was Jacob's, and I recognized the careful way he wrote my name, the same way he used to label his school folders when he was little. Inside was a single page. I read it once, then again, letting the words anchor themselves. He had left the warehouse. He wanted to learn the trade the right way, and he wanted to learn it from me. There was a line written with a firmer hand that held me still for a long breath. You stood up when everybody thought you were finished. I want to stand beside that kind of man. The house felt smaller after that, as if the walls were holding in something warmer than they used to. I folded the letter and slipped it into my jacket pocket before stepping outside. The air carried the early scent of cut grass from somewhere down the street and the faint hum of trucks on the highway beyond town. The sign above the shop door looked almost shy in the light, and sun still a little crooked from when Jacob and I nailed it in place, but truer than any straight line a machine could cut. Jacob arrived not long after, walking with that quiet determination men find when they have finally decided who they want to be. He stood beside me for a moment, taking in the old sin, then he nodded once as if confirming something with himself. I asked if he slept any. He smiled in a tired way and said he had slept enough to start fresh. We stepped inside together. The shop smelled of steel warming against the machines and the faint trace of coffee drifting from the counter. Jacob moved toward the mill with a familiarity that surprised me. He did not touch it at first. He only watched the slow rotation of the spindle as it came to life. He asked if I wanted him to start with cleanup or with the measurements. His voice was steady in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager, asking if I could teach him how to change the oil in his first truck. Begin where you feel honest, I said. He nodded, then pulled on a pair of gloves and started clearing the bench, arranging tools the way he had seen me do 1,000 times. There was no rush in his movements, only intent. A quiet trust filled the room, settling into the spaces between the machines. I stepped back and let him work. For a few minutes I simply listened to the rise of the mill, the soft ticking of the overhead lights warming the air, and the rhythm of my son finding his way beside me. That sound settled into my chest in a way I had not expected. Through the front window I caught sight of someone standing across the street. Bradley looked thinner than I remembered, the kind of thin that comes from weeks of restless sleep and too many days spent waiting for news that never comes the way you hope it will. He did not move. He only watched the shop with a stillness that felt heavier than any anger he had thrown my way before. I stepped outside, letting the door ease shut behind me. The air held a faint snap of early morning chill. Bradley's shoulders lifted just slightly when he saw me, but his eyes stayed low. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The years between us sat quietly like a third presence on the sidewalk. He looked as if he wanted to speak, but the words never rose. I offered him the smallest nod, not forgiveness, not approval, just an acknowledgement that a chapter had ended where it needed to. He held my gaze long enough to understand it, then turned and walked away down the empty stretch of road. At no point did I feel hatred, only a calm I had spent years searching for. When I stepped back inside, Jacob was standing near the mill holding a tool he had just cleaned. He asked if everything was all right. I told him it was. He studied my face for half a second and then returned to his work, more sure of himself than he had been a moment earlier. Later that afternoon, I checked my inbox on the small computer in the corner. The quarterly report had arrived. Revenue was marked well beyond what I ever imagined for a small shop. 1.4 million. The number sat on the screen without fanfare. I felt no jolt of victory, no pull toward pride. It was simply a measure of how far the truth could travel when a man stood behind his work without bending. I shut the computer gently and walked back to the doorway. Jacob was lining up a bar of steel beneath the press, checking the angle twice the way I had always taught. The sun fell across the floor in a long band of gold, brushing his shoulders with a warmth I had not seen on him in years. I pulled a chair to the open threshold and sat with a cup of coffee cooling between my palms. The machines inside settled into their familiar heartbeat. The scent of hot metal drifted across the air, mixing with the quiet breeze rolling down from the ridge. The morning had stretched into a steady afternoon, and everything around me felt held in place by something stronger than luck. I thought of my father then, of the way he used to stand in his old workshop, letting the sound of his tools guide the day. I could almost hear him telling me to trust the steel trust, the work trust, the man I had tried to be. For the first time, I understood what he meant. The sun dipped a little lower, throwing a pale warmth across the street. Jacob looked over his shoulder, catching my eye for a brief second. There was no need for words. Something had settled between us, something earned through quiet days and repaired trusts. I leaned back, letting the air move through the doorway, breathing slow and deep as the last light warmed the edge of the shop. The world felt open again, steady and sure, waiting without demand. And in that stillness, I was ready for whatever came next.